Hi guys, it's Julius from So It's Your Style, and as your responsible socialist neighbor, I do feel like I have the responsibility of educating you on some of the most basic things that every beginner dressmaking classes or every beginner sewing classes fail to tell you. And yes, you heard it right. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you tips that will actually help you sew smarter, better, and will actually save you time from bringing your machine to a service center. So if you're someone who's planning to get a new machine or someone who's been sewing quite recently, stick around because you might pick up a few tips. Let's get started! Tip number 1. Change needles. So most likely, if you have recently acquired a sewing machine, you unbox the machine, you familiarize yourself with the accessories and everything that came with it. I'm pretty sure you want to get started right on your sewing project. But hold on, you are going to have to change the needle that came with the machine. Yes, you heard it right. You have to change the needle that came with the machine because who knows how long that sewing machine needle has been in there. You want to start with a fresh and correct size needle before getting on with your projects. If you are someone who has been sewing quite recently and still don't know how often you should change your needles, well, you have to change your needles every 2 to 3 projects, depending on how heavy the projects are, or after 8 hours of sewing, whether continuous or not, and of course if you are switching to a different fabric type. Now here's my question for you. When's the last time you changed your needle? If you don't know the answer to this question, well, definitely you have to change it now. Go ahead, change it while I wait here. Tip number 2. Do not pull the thread from the top of the machine when changing thread spools. This is a big no-no. Well, it's not good for your machine, really. Let me tell you why. So threads are like fabrics. They have fibers too. And if you take a look at a strand of thread under a microscope, you'll actually see this. They actually look like twisted strands of fibers, or yes, fibers, that has a lot of loose ends. And well, of course, it depends on the quality of your thread. But most threads look like this under the microscope. Now, those loose ends are actually what becomes lint that goes into the inner workings of your sewing machine when you're sewing or when you're threading. And those loose ends on the fibers actually goes against the way you thread your sewing machine. So imagine if you pull the thread from the top of the machine, you're actually pulling it against its grain, causing the thread to shed a lot of lint, which is not good for your sewing machine because if you are not regularly cleaning your sewing machine, then those lint will get collected and they will cause issues or problems for your sewing machine in the future. Tip number 3. Use the right spool pin for the right spool of thread. Okay, this is just plain and simple. If you want to avoid thread breakage or knots or tension problems, you want to use the right spool pin for the type of thread you're using. And when I say this, there are actually 2 types of thread based on how they are wound on the spool. Horizontal spool pins are actually for spools of threads that are cross-wound, which means the strands are wound in a zigzag design, while vertical spool pins are actually for stacked thread in which they are parallel with the spool, or the threads are actually wound parallel to the spool, if that makes sense. Now, if you use a stacked thread on a horizontal spool pin, chances are 99% you will get a thread breakage or a knot at the end of the spool pin. Tip number 4. Do not mess with the machine tension on your sewing machine. Now, most of the time, if you get a new machine or if you buy a new sewing machine, the default tension is set to 4 because 4 is actually the average sewing tension on most fabrics. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the tension dial on your sewing machine, it's actually located most of the time on top of where the needle is. It goes from 0 all the way to 9 on most sewing machines. So when I say don't mess with the tension, I only mean do not play with it or change it unless it is called for. Say if you are doing gathering stitches, basting stitches, or pretty much that are not utilitarian in nature. So just always set it to 4, and I assure you, you won't have tension issues in the future, and you will always have nice and beautiful stitches. Tip number 5. Pay attention to the take-up lever and the needle when you're sewing. So every time you end a seam or a stitch, you want to always raise the needle and the take-up lever to their highest position before pulling out the fabric. And this is to ensure that the tension has been released on the tension disc before you pull the fabric out. Well, this is just a very simple tip that will actually help you avoid tension problems in the future or every time you're sewing, and which is actually related to my next tip. Tip number 6. Do not turn the hand wheel away from you. So the machine hand wheel is actually designed to go counterclockwise, which is towards you. And if you make it a habit of turning it away from you, you will eventually create an issue with the timing of the machine. And when I say the timing that can affect the movement of the take-up lever and the needle. The hand wheel doesn't want to turn away from you. It naturally wants to go towards you. And that's actually how it's designed. So resist the urge in doing so, because especially if you are using a mechanical machine wherein you have to actually turn the hand wheel to raise the needle and pull your fabric out. But if you are using an automatic sewing machine, then it's easier for you because you have the needle up and down button that you just need to press, and it will actually raise the needle and you can pull the fabric out. Tip number 7. Never use threads that are actually not recommended by your sewing machine manual. I am so guilty about this. Once upon a time, I have used a 20 weight thread on my Brother F420, and I just heard a loud snapping sound simply because it cannot handle the thickness of the thread. So what happens if you use a thread that is not recommended by your sewing machine manual? Well, again, it will actually create tension problems with your sewing machine. Well, you heard me talking about tension a lot of times. Well, it's because the hallmark of a beautiful made garment is through the stitching. If you have great tension on your sewing machine, most definitely your sewing machine will produce very nice stitching. Tip number 8. Clean your bobbin case every 2 to 3 projects, or your sewing machine in general. So the sewing process itself actually leaves a lot of lint on your sewing machine. And if they are left uncleaned, well... Tip number 9. Do not oil your sewing machine unless it is called for. So if you are using a Brother sewing machine, like I am, chances are you don't need to oil your sewing machine because it's been pre-oiled and that oil is enough to last for years of sewing. But I would still recommend that you bring your machine probably twice or once a year on a service center just to get it checked out. And this leads me to my tip number 10. Do not troubleshoot a sewing machine by yourself. I would highly advise you to bring it to a service center so that a professional technician can actually check it out. Because you'll never know what you're going to end up with if you do it by yourself. So there you go, ladies and gentlefolks, my top sewing tips for beginners that most beginner sewing classes fail to tell you. And these are some of the most basic tips and information that can actually help you sew smarter and better. And you'll appreciate them in time once you get into the habit of following them. So once again, it's Julius from Sew It's Your Style. And I hope that you learned a few tips or all of the tips in today's video. And I will see you in my future project.